Are the Winnipeg Jets currently being disrespected in the betting market to win the Central Division, being behind the Colorado Avalanche despite being 8 points up of them in the division right now? Breaking this down, and if Rasmus Dahlin could be a great value bet to win the Norris this season. Welcome back to Edgework here on the Hammer Betting Network. We are typically live Monday through Friday at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time here on the Edgework YouTube channel. So if you're looking for daily live content, or if you're looking for more videos like this, or the Edgework podcast featuring David Pagnotta, Dennis Bernstein, and Zach Bodenstein, please make sure to hit that subscribe button. Like this video, you can also turn on notifications so you get notified every time we go live or more videos like this come out. You don't want to miss any of that. You definitely don't want to miss our daily picks as we are up 42 units on the year so far. But today we will be looking more into futures markets, specifically going to be looking at the Central Division and potential value out in the Atlantic, what might come out of that, some side bets that you could make with some value there. So Andy, let's start with something you're looking at in the Central Division right now. There's obviously a race heating up here as we're seeing Colorado make a push trying to get into this playoffs, into a solid playoff spot, I should say, rather than into the playoffs, grabbing onto the final wild card spot. But you're looking at a spot here in the Central where Dallas is leading the division. They're 1 point up on Winnipeg, and they have a game in hand on them. They're on a 3-game losing streak going into this All-Star break right now, but regardless, they've still been a solid team all year. You got a resurgence in Jamie Benn, in Tyler Seguin. A lot of that comes from some of the youthful legs and guys like Jason Robertson, Ty Dellandre, and an incredible goaltender backing you up in Jake Ottinger. But you're looking a little bit more to some value that you can find in the futures market in a team like Winnipeg sitting behind them, and more specifically because of the price that you could find on them. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's always about the price. And just looking at the Dallas Stars, I mean, looking at Dallas and Winnipeg, neither team had a strong January. The Jets went 9-6, which isn't too bad, but they closed out the month going 3-5, so kind of limped out of the month of January and into the All-Star break. The Stars went 5-4-4, I believe, picked up some more loser points. They've got 10 on the season, and that's a big reason why they're in the position that they're in right now. The Jets actually have the most regulation wins of any Western Conference playoff team, but they've also got the most regulation losses, so that's been holding them back. They've only got 1 point in an overtime loss so far this season. So Winnipeg, you know, I think they're a comparable team. I don't think they're as far behind the Dallas Stars as maybe the market has this rivalry right now. I think Dallas is a pretty strong team, but you look, the goaltending is very comparable. Winnipeg's arguably better on offense, maybe not on the season, but over the last month, the Jets were one of the best offensive teams in the league in terms of generating shots and scoring chances, top 10 team by expected goals. And since they've gotten Nikolai Ehlers back in the lineup, they've been the aggressor more often than not. And I think that we've yet to see what this team is actually capable of on offense, and we're going to get a good look throughout the stretch run here and into the NHL playoffs. And both teams kind of locks to make the playoffs at this point, but I think I'm pretty surprised seeing the Stars at -145 at some shops to win the Central Division. I've got them and the Winnipeg Jets around the same odds. I think both teams should be priced around that +190 range, and the Jets are at around +550 or 6-1. So I think you've got to consider Winnipeg right now. They're only 1 point behind the Stars. They do have that tiebreaker, and both teams. I'd say the Jets have a bit of a tougher schedule remaining, but it's going to be a tight race. And like you said, Minnesota, Colorado, right in the thick of things. The things are slipping a little bit away from the Wild. They were kind of solely in that third spot there, but now the Avs are just a point behind them, and Colorado's only played 48 games, so there's a lot of time to play catch up. It's going to be an interesting race, but I think the value is on the Jets right now.
Well, I find it interesting looking at this. You mentioned you can find Dallas, to win the Central -140, and you're talking about how you have them around the same price as the Jets to win this one. One thing I found really interesting when I pulled up the odds on Central Division winners was the fact that Colorado was priced at 375 on some different shops to win this Central Division. Now, obviously, as you talked about, they have 48 games played. They're 4 games in hand on the Jets, the team that is behind them, I guess, essentially in the odds. And if you win the next 4 games, then you close that 8-point gap and you're essentially tied with the Jets. You go 4-0 in the next 4 games, then that's eliminated. But in what sense how does this make sense for Colorado to be so much further ahead of Winnipeg just in a odds standings to win this Central Division when they really do have to close that gap? They've dealt with some injuries. It's not like their goaltending is as, I don't want to say sure, but that's probably the best word that can come to mind, as like sure as Winnipeg's is with Connor Hellebuck. Why do you think there is that discrepancy in the odds between the Jets and the Avs to win the Central Division right now?
Yeah, I really don't know. I mean, I can't speak to the book's liability or anything like that, but I would imagine that they've taken quite a few bets on the Avalanche throughout the season, and maybe they're trying to protect themselves from more Avalanche money. But it's definitely something that I don't agree with. I have the Avs priced closer to plus 510. In terms of their chances of winning the division, which equates to about a 16% chance. So I mean, I don't agree with it. I think they're right in there. It's possible, but they'd have to almost run the table to catch both Dallas and Winnipeg and overtake them here in the last 30 games.
So would you think that there's a pretty good value on Jets to win the Central at that plus 550 number that we're seeing right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bet that will still lose more often than it wins, but
Sure.
I think they're the value bet in the Central Division when we're talking about those top 4 teams. I mean, mathematically, you might be able to make a case for a team like that's farther down with bigger odds, but realistically, we're looking at the 4 teams that have a shot here.
All right, and now flipping over to the Eastern Conference, specifically in the Atlantic. It's kind of interesting watching this one unfold because Boston is just running away with this one. They go on a 3-game losing streak, immediately snapped out against the Leafs, and it just looks like they're right back to where they were. Of course, I mean, you want to talk about Groundhog Day. The very
Leafs,
next day after that is quite literally Groundhog Day. So what else do you expect?
Compete with Brandon Carlo and Derek Forbert and AJ Greer. They don't have the guns to run with those guys.
Yeah. Anyways, Boston continuing to run away in the East, in the Atlantic specifically there. No one can really catch up to them, so that is just foregone conclusion. Like, they're going to take this one, I mean, barring anything significant happening down the stretch here. But
92% chance, that's what I have right now, that they finish first.
Right. But you're looking down further in the Eastern Conference. This has typically been a conference over the past 3-5 years, I guess you could say, where you basically around Christmas you say these are the teams that are going to make the playoffs, and that's it. And we're essentially in a position now where we know most of the matchups that are likely going to happen. It's whether or not who's at home and when those series will start and those kinds of things. But a couple of weeks ago, we talked about on one of the Edgework Live shows, the Sabres sitting at plus 500 to make the playoffs. Right now, I'm looking at them down to about plus 300, plus 250, depends where you can find them, what books you have. This team has gone on a run. They're really exciting to watch. Some of that value on them to make the playoffs might be gone now, considering where they were just 2 weeks ago. It may still be there, but there are other opportunities to bet on the Sabres to make the playoffs here, essentially. Those could come from other markets. What are you looking at specifically in the Atlantic Division and the Buffalo Sabres here where you could see some value on some futures?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think Buffalo technically is a good bet to make the playoffs, but like you said, there were far better prices earlier in the season. A lot of the value, obviously, most of the value has come and gone. But yeah, technically I think they are a good bet to make the playoffs. I've got them making the playoffs around 40% of the time. So obviously their odds should be, much shorter than 3-1. But I guess it's worth mentioning that my forecast is on the optimistic side. If you look at moneypuck.com, they have the Sabres at around 38% to make the playoffs. And then Don Lucian over at The Athletic, he's got the Sabres with just a 14% chance to make the playoffs. They've got a tough schedule. There's some questions about their goaltending. Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen has been excellent, especially recently. But he's only got 34 NHL games under his belt, and he's still kind of an unknown. So there is that. And as I mentioned, with Winnipeg having the most regulation wins, the Sabres are behind all of the teams that they're competing with in the wild card race in terms of regulation wins, and they've got the fewest out of those 5 teams. But it's going to be an interesting race. They're being chased closely by the Islanders and the Panthers right now. Just behind the Penguins, a few points behind the Capitals, but they've got a few, 3 games in hand on Washington. They've got Pittsburgh has 1 game in hand, but they've got 2 games in hand on the Panthers and the Islanders, which is a good spot to be in. And yeah, I mean, all things considered, it's a pretty decent spot to be in for Sabres fans. Although you'd hate to be on that, outside of the playoff picture looking in and get that kind of get a bad draft pick in the process. But given where we thought the Sabres were going to be at to start the season, they had a regular season point total of 77.5. Nobody really had this team on their radar as being a playoff team. So they're definitely, punching above their weight class here. They're overachieving, and whether or not they can do that for another 32 games remains to be seen. But I think if they do make the playoffs, Rasmus Dahlin is my front runner for the Norris Trophy. A few months ago, we talked Erik Karlsson all the time and how big the gap was between Karlsson and everybody else in terms of points per game and just the raw totals that he was putting up. And it was almost as if he was a shoo-in for the Norris. And I think you see as time has gone on and that gap has closed a bit, now Dahlin, 55 points in 49 games, and potentially helping the Sabres get into the playoffs. It's going to build a really strong case for him being, the second most or the second leading scorer among defensemen in the NHL behind Karlsson, who's not on a playoff team. And you look at Dahlin's defensive numbers, the Sabres are outscoring teams by a full goal when Dahlin is on the ice per 60 minutes at 5-on-5, or at least they were before that Carolina game when they lost 5-1. So that might have altered things a little bit. But, the fact is that Buffalo is a very good team when Dahlin is on the ice. And I think people are going to recognize that. But whether or not he can win the award, I think, comes down to whether the Sabres make the playoffs. And he's priced as high as 5-1. I think that's the best price that I saw anyway. And, at that price, if you think the Sabres have a chance to make the playoffs and you're considering making that bet, then I think you've got to consider betting on Dahlin to win the Norris Trophy as well.
All right, so I guess a follow-up question to you on that is you mentioned Erik Karlsson and everyone sitting there basically putting him as the front runner, and that's essentially because of the amount of points that he's put up so far this season. But San Jose's far out of it. They're going to be a seller here at the deadline. And now you're talking about the importance of the Sabres making the playoffs to go along with the candidacy for the Dahlin Norris trophy kind of run that he's on here. How important is it that the Sabres make the playoffs, and what kind of valuation would you say that would go into that? And I guess I'm more coming at it from the perspective of, yes, Karlsson ahead of him in points, but his team is going to be way further behind. They never really had a shot at the playoffs here. And even if the Sabres don't make the playoffs, they're going to be in competition, or they're going to be competing for it all the way down the stretch. That's their goal. They think they can do it. Let's say they just miss. Does he still have a chance, or at that point is it shot like, hey, you were way further, or you were further behind in points than a guy like Karlsson. Your team also didn't make the playoffs. What kind of valuation does that impact it?
Well, so only, as far as I can tell, there have only been 5 defensemen in NHL history that have won the Norris Trophy on teams that did not qualified for the playoffs in that same season, and Erik Karlsson is one of them. He did it with the Senators in 2012. They were not a playoff team, but he, finished with a 25-point gap between him and the next best defenseman, I believe. So that pretty much did it, right? There was no, there wasn't much of an argument who was the best defenseman in the NHL with that much of a gap, I think. But as far as Dahlin's chances, I think making the playoffs does sort of make or break his chances of winning it. I'm not saying that he won't still possibly get nominated if the Sabres don't make the playoffs. I just think it makes it harder for people to give him their first place vote if the Sabres don't make the playoffs. If the Sabres make the playoffs, it just makes it easier. I mean, it's you're choosing, if there's only 5 points separating him and Karlsson when it's all said and done or something like that. I mean, maybe you don't want to nominate two players that have or nominate a guy that missed the playoffs over a guy like Dahlin, right? I mean, it's going to have an impact on how people think about the award, and I think in general, I mean, you look elsewhere, you look at Cale Makar. I mean, he's going to get credited with helping the Avalanche make the playoffs. All of the injuries that they had this year, he played 27 minutes a night. He's a point-per-game player. I think he's going to receive a lot of credit, and that's probably going to result in first place and second place votes for him when it comes time to vote for the Norris. And you're probably going to see a good player get left off the ballot this year. I mean, I look at Adam Fox, who could easily win the Norris this year, but has he done enough to really separate himself in terms of the narrative, the storyline, which matters to the voters? It does. So I think it's going to be interesting. I think there's a handful or more of very deserving defensemen that could be nominated, but there's going to be two or three guys that don't get a nom, and a lot of value that goes by the wayside because of it.
All right, Andy, appreciate the insight. If you enjoyed the content, please make sure to hit like on this video, subscribe to the Edgework YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter at EdgeworkHQ to get notified every time we're going to go live. You can turn on those notification buttons here on the Edgework YouTube channel. You get notified when we're going to go live, when a new podcast with David Pagnotta, Dennis Bernstein, and Zach Bodenstein come out every Wednesday, and every time videos just like this one drop, updating futures, markets, reacting to trades, rumors, and as we approach the trade deadline, things will be heating up, so you're going to want to catch that all here on the Edgework YouTube channel. Andy, thank you for your time today. Good luck on your futures bets. Enjoy the All-Star weekend, and we'll catch everyone very soon.